The summit is, the leaders are beginning to arrive for the summit. So in that context, talking about BIMSTEC, now it is striking that BIMSTEC is unique to the extent that it's an inter-regional grouping. It straddles two geographical regions, South Asia and Southeast Asia. And naturally, connectivity would be one of the agenda items for BIMSTEC. In that context, you think there's scope for doing more in terms of acting as a bridge between these two geographic regions, South Asia and Southeast Asia, for BIMSTEC in particular?
Ramesh, we are already hearing that Maritime Transport Cooperation Agreement is likely to be signed during this summit meeting.
Right.
And also that they are going to announce the Vision 2030 draft of which is already ready, it seems, to create a prosperous, resilient and open or pro-BIMSTEC now. So there is a specific focus on connectivity as a major driver for economic development and social progress. BIMSTEC, even if it has had only 6 summit meetings in last 28 years, has come thus far, partly because the countries that are now participating in it see enormous stakes in working together. And that is very visible, the way, for example, Colombo Summit happened. Even if it happened online, it was able to achieve quite a great deal, including the charter, which converted a grouping into an organization, which makes much more structured meetings possible. And the fact that this is also in-person meeting after 7 years, after the Kathmandu Summit meeting of 2018, which would now include several bilaterals. And in most multilaterals, these bilaterals play a crucial role in how agenda that is discussed and determined at the multilateral level is actually implemented on the ground in that sense. Already India is, as we are saying, a major player of the several centers which different countries are taking lead on. India leads on centers for information and tourism in New Delhi, in energy in Bangalore, and of course another one in Noida, for example. So India is playing a certain role, and there are now going to be increasingly regular meetings at not just summit level, but also, for example, at ministerial level. We saw recently the meeting of foreign ministers. Then, of course, there's also a working group of ambassadors that meets almost monthly, and then business and economic forums and so on. So there is enormous structuring or structure building that has already happened, which will ensure that the leaders, when they meet in person, they're able to take certain consensus forward and give a strategic direction. And it is implemented on the ground in that sense, because there are several other mechanisms, channels and structures which are already put in place. And I think that is what makes us feel that, particularly because SAARC is in coma, as we often say, this has become an alternative connect. And this is not new. As you mentioned, way back in 1997, 4 countries, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and India had come together, which means they were already a cross-regional connect at that time. And then, of course, immediately in December of 1997 itself, Myanmar joined it. Later in 2004, we had 2 more countries joining, Bhutan and Nepal joining it. So in that sense, I think this cross-regional connect between Himalayas and Bay of Bengal has stayed on course in that sense. And I think increasingly there's a much more momentum visible in how these 7 countries want to work together. It's likely that in coming times, once they become fairly robust and confident, they could add other nations as well in various formats of dialogue partners or special invitees and so on. The Prime Minister's visit to Sri Lanka from here is also going to add on to what is agreed in BIMSTEC, because a lot of cooperation is also taking place, whether transition to green energy or counter-terrorism and so on, is continuum of BIMSTEC in that sense at bilateral level again. So India in that sense is seen as a country that can take lead in several sectors, though formally it is seen as a leader in security and energy, something that was decided that in Colombo Summit, the BIMSTEC before that had identified 14 priority areas, the whole lot of trade and investment, technology, energy, tourism, agriculture, fisheries, environment, culture, health, poverty, terrorism, so on. In Colombo Summit, they decided that they should be brought down to 7 priority areas, with each of the 7 members taking lead in each of these particular priority areas. And India has taken responsibility of security and energy in that
Right.
sense. So transition to green energy, issues of piracy, of terrorism, of all sort of non-traditional security, of pandemics, healthcare, and so on, disaster relief, are all areas where India is seen as a country to look to. And India is, I think, seen playing a major role, particularly if you look at the way bilaterals are happening. Indian Prime Minister is meeting almost all other nations, both at multilateral and then at bilateral level as well, is, I think, going to give opportunity for leaders to directly in person build that chemistry, understanding, share notes to see where they want to take BIMSTEC forward. And that will mean that this, even if it looks like cross regional, transnational, trans-regional, it is fundamentally around Bay of Bengal.
Right.
Countries that have stakes in Bay of Bengal are coming together to make sure that they can work together in building partnerships in these 7 identified areas. And I think we are going to see a great deal of that very visibly clarified in the vision statement, Vision 2030, which is also going to be signed today, along with the Maritime Transport Agreement, which will perhaps reinforce something that has been already going on in terms of building connectivity at various bilateral levels, but now at the multilateral level as well in the summit meeting.
Right. And if I may take a pause here and inform our viewers that Prime Minister Modi has Thailand relations. Professor Singh, I don't know whether you could watch the visuals we are playing out, that of the meeting between the leaders of India and Myanmar this morning in Bangkok. If I can start by asking you about Myanmar. Now, Myanmar is just still recovering from the devastating earthquake. We've seen how the military coup took place in February 2021. Is there scope for BIMSTEC and or India to do more to tackle the situation obtaining in Myanmar today as we speak? Because I ask you this because Myanmar is virtually persona non grata for the ASEAN, but here the senior general of Myanmar is being feted and spoken to. So can BIMSTEC succeed where ASEAN failed?
Thank you, Ramesh. You have partly also answered your question. The entire expectation after the coup took place in Myanmar was that ASEAN will be the leading regional forum that will bring back stability and potentially democracy back in Myanmar. And as you mentioned, since ASEAN has not been able to deliver, it seems BIMSTEC could potentially be an alternative forum. Also, remember, this is the first foreign visit of General Liang after the coup took place. And in that sense, in-person meeting with the whole set of leaders of BIMSTEC, and particularly India. You see, in BIMSTEC, other than Thailand, which has been a force to reckon with in regionalization of Southeast Asia, India is a major player in that sense in ensuring regionalization and implementing various initiatives. And when it comes to Myanmar, again, India is a major contributor, whether it is Operation Brahma in immediate crisis or in terms of building the long-term connectivity. For example, the trilateral expressway, which will connect Myanmar to not just South Asia, but also to Southeast Asia in that sense, all the way to Indo-Pacific domain. So I think India's connectivity and India's focus could bring change in how India connects with the military junta in Myanmar and what it can bring. You see, India from tsunami of 2004 has been very clearly a major leader in the region on disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. And in about last decade, we have seen the focus shifting to building disaster resilient infrastructure.
Right.
And in that sense, I think particularly when you look at this in terms of the recent earthquake, India has enormous potential or leverages, if you wish to call, to bring back stability and deal with the situation in Myanmar. And I'm sure in this bilateral meeting that they must have shared notes on what more India can do in Myanmar. And in that sense, brings India in a closer connection with the leadership there to see whether then India in long run can also bring back stability, peace, and potentially democracy back in Myanmar. India, I think, is in that sense very clearly a major actor in absence of ASEAN being able to make any fundamental difference in the ground situation there. India in BIMSTEC also is a major player. I mean, 32% of the budget of Secretariat is borne by India. As you mentioned, the BIMSTEC together is about 5.2 trillion economy of 7 nations, in which nearly 4 trillion, 3.9 trillion is that of India. So, it's interesting to see that BIMSTEC wants to take several initiatives, but India can actually bring forward much of its leverages capabilities to implement several of these BIMSTEC initiatives and to stabilize and take BIMSTEC forward. It will also be important not to leave any country behind. And in that sense, India would make sure that Myanmar is brought back as a normal member, active member into BIMSTEC, because India has an enormous focus on BIMSTEC itself, whether it is the least recent focus on economic development in India's northeast or building infrastructure and ports in Andaman Nicobar, that connects India immediately to the Bay of Bengal region. Then, of course, India's focus on Act East, Act Far East, the more recent vision of Mahasagar, mutual and holistic security and growth for all, that was outlined by Prime Minister in Mauritius recently. In whole set of base of India's neighborhood first policy, BIMSTEC has become a kind of a very attractive hub, not just of how India wants to engage with the larger region of Indo-Pacific, but also how in immediate region of Bay of Bengal and South Asia, in also in some sense countering China. You see, this is one regional forum where China doesn't sit in. And, in multiple ways, India has put enormous focus on BIMSTEC, and Myanmar being an important member of BIMSTEC, I think it is also important that India will make sure that much more normalization takes place in how BIMSTEC is seen in regional forums. And in that sense, whether it is on the ground supporting, dealing with the disaster on the ground, or normalizing Myanmar's acceptance in and participation in regional forums like BIMSTEC, this bilateral meeting in the morning, I think, will kind of lay new grounds in that sense, how direct conversations between two national leaders can give a certain direction to how bilateral can then contribute to the multilateral layer.
Indeed. Professor Singh, you referred to the earthquake. In that context, Ambassador Dorai is a former Indian ambassador to Thailand and a former High Commissioner to Kenya. And Professor Singh teaches at the JNU in New Delhi. Professor Singh, before we took that break, you were discussing about the 7 pillars in the BIMSTEC regional grouping, and you spoke about how India heads or chairs the security pillar. In that context, is there scope for doing more either bilaterally or within the BIMSTEC framework to ramp up defense cooperation among the member states? I ask you this because India, for instance, has given a submarine to Myanmar. Thailand is probably looking to India for more on that front. In that context, maybe Coast Guard cooperation or cyber security or maritime security, is there scope for India to become a net security provider for the BIMSTEC countries in particular?
As you said, Ramesh, India is already recognized as a net security provider in the region. So whether it is non-traditional security like disaster relief or terrorism or pandemics or healthcare, or it is the conventional military cooperation, India definitely has been taking the lead. You would remember in 2018, there was MILEX 18 that took place of BIMSTEC nations doing a exercise, countering terrorism exercise together, which involved meeting in New Delhi of all the army chiefs of these countries. So there is already a track record of India having taken initiative in both non-traditional security sectors, but also in traditional military cooperation as well. And therefore, I think that would be part of the discussion in BIMSTEC, whether it is in bilateral or even in multilateral. We are looking forward to the speech by Indian Prime Minister. But I also heard the Secretary General BIMSTEC just now being interviewed and telling us what are expected to be major outcomes from this summit meeting. And I heard Ambassador Dorai earlier mentioning that India's first FTA, free trade agreement, actually was with Thailand. And we remember you mentioned the 7 pillars of the 7 priority areas of BIMSTEC. Thailand is actually the country that takes lead in trade and investment. And I saw that there is no clear indication as of now where the FTA negotiations that began in 2018 and have already set up a subcommittee to negotiate that FTA as to whether that is getting any momentum in that sense, particularly when the host country is also the lead country in trade and investment priority area. So I hope that there will be some indication, whether from Indian Prime Minister's speech or later in Bangkok Declaration or in Vision 2030, as to where they want to take forward their FTA, free trade agreement, that will facilitate enormous opportunities for whether we are talking of India's northeast, which now has rail and road connectivity to all seven sisters, all the seven provinces are connected, and given the relative stability and peace that we have witnessed in last decade, they would be looking for opportunities to connect beyond in national borders to immediate regional other neighbors. Like Thailand could be a great example to build connectivity, whether maritime or on land. So in that sense, I think other than the fact that India would be a leading nation in taking forward the concerns and challenges of non-traditional securities issues like disaster relief, or even traditional security areas like military cooperation, military exercises, but also in terms of how they can add on development to security and take forward their trade negotiations, and whether we can see FTA negotiations moving forward other than the other sectors of energy, security, healthcare, and so on, education, science, and technology. We will see several outcomes, as Secretary General just mentioned, that there are going to be several positive indicators of positive momentum coming from the summit meeting. And I think some of that indication will be visible now from the speech of Indian Prime Minister that we are looking forward to listen to.
Professor Singh, I know you are pressed for time. You have other prior commitments, so may I thank you for making time for us and joining us on this special broadcast and sharing your thoughts and views with our viewers at home and abroad. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. Right, we still have with us Ambassador Suchita